The plane was full of live people, talking, laughing, rushing to find their seats, some settling in with their pillows and blankets, others scanning the overhead compartments for their luggage, everyone bustling through the motions of another routine flight. But among them was a man who seemed out of place, his face lined with the history of many years, a man who carried the weight of time in the subtle creases of his eyes, and the quiet way he sat there, so still, his hands resting on the armrests in front of him, his gaze lost in the horizon. Outside the small oval window, the faint glint of the sun caught in his eyes. He looked like someone who had seen a world far different from the one inside this cramped airplane cabin, a world that had shaped him into the man he was today. Claire, the young flight attendant, had been on this route hundreds of times. She knew the ins and outs of the job well. The routines were second nature to her. It was the kind of work where you could perform without thinking, where you moved like a machine through the aisles doing your job, checking the seatbelts, offering drinks and snacks. But today, something about the man caught her attention. She noticed how he sat like a soldier at attention, though his hair was grey, and his shoulders stooped slightly as if time had taken its toll. There was something in his posture, something that commanded respect. She couldn't explain it. But there was a presence to him, a quiet intensity that the other passengers lacked. But Claire had a job to do, and so she moved on the moment. She stepped into the aisle to assist a few passengers. She forgot about him as the noise and bustle of the cabin took over her focus, shifting from one task to the next. But in the corner of her mind she couldn't shake the feeling that this man wasn't like the others. The veteran's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his bag in the overhead compartment, and though Claire didn't see it, she noticed the way his eyes darted across the cabin, as if he was assessing every detail of his surroundings like a soldier scanning a battlefield, his face expressionless yet sharp. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing the final preparations for takeoff, and Claire hurriedly made her way back to her position at the front of the cabin to ensure everyone was buckled up. The sounds of the plane's engines revving grew louder, and the flight attendants all moved into place. Claire briefly glanced back at the veteran, who was now looking down at a small stack of papers he had pulled from his bag, his brow furrowed in concentration, yet he remained still, barely moving. Claire couldn't help but notice the faint smell of an old cologne that lingered in the air as she passed by him. It was a scent she remembered from her childhood, from the men in her life who had lived hard lives, worked hard, and carried the weight of their experiences with them like a badge of honor. The scent made her pause for just a moment, and in that moment she wondered who he was. As the plane accelerated down the runway, the veteran's hands tightened around the armrest, his knuckles going white. Claire didn't see this, but the other passengers in the nearby rows could feel the tension in the air. Something about him felt different, but none of them dared to ask. The moment the plane lifted off the ground, the veteran closed his eyes for a moment, his lips moving almost imperceptibly, as if he were saying a prayer to himself. Claire caught the movement in the corner of her eye, but didn't think much of it. It wasn't until later, as the plane began to level out, that she would realize just how wrong she had been to dismiss him so quickly. The veteran had a story to tell, but Claire wasn't ready to hear it yet. The plane hummed along in the sky as Claire moved through the aisles, checking on passengers, making sure everyone was settled, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the veteran, the way he sat so still, the way his eyes moved, as if constantly assessing every detail around him. She couldn't explain it, but something about him unsettled her. It wasn't just his age or the quiet confidence he exuded, it was the way he seemed to be waiting for something she couldn't understand. She shook off the feeling and focused on her work. It wasn't until about 30 minutes into the flight that she heard his voice, a quiet request barely above a whisper, but enough to make her pause. She turned toward him and saw him looking up from his seat, his hand resting lightly on the armrest, his eyes meeting hers with a calm intensity that made her hesitate for a moment. He asked if she could help him adjust his seat. His knee was bothering him, and the discomfort was becoming unbearable. Claire gave him a polite smile, but in her mind she was already thinking about the other tasks she needed to do. The other passengers who were waiting for drinks and snacks. Her mind raced through the list of things she had to accomplish, and for a brief moment she just wanted to move on, but she didn't show it. She gave him a quick nod and said she would be right back with the seatbelt extension. But before she could move on, another passenger flagged her down for a drink, and Claire found herself walking away from the veteran before he could say another word. The movement in the cabin was constant. The small space felt crowded with people, all asking for small favors, all with their own needs and demands. And in the middle of it all was the veteran sitting silently, now adjusting himself as best he could despite the pain. She had seen him wince when he tried to shift, but she was too focused on the task in front of her to give him much thought. As Claire moved down the aisle, she could feel the subtle tug of guilt pulling at her. The veteran had asked for something so simple, but she hadn't taken the time to help him. She brushed it off, telling herself there were more pressing matters at hand. After all, wasn't that her job, to serve the majority, to make sure the whole cabin was taken care of? There would be time to help him later, but deep down she knew it wasn't right. Every time she passed by his seat, she caught glimpses of him looking out the window, as if he were lost in a memory, his gaze distant and unfocused. She could hear the slight hum of his breath, but nothing else. No complaints, no demands, just quiet patience, the kind of patience that could only come from years of experience, a kind of understanding of the world around him that Claire couldn't quite grasp. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity of rushing between passengers, she made her way back toward him. And before she could say anything, the veteran spoke again, his voice low and measured, asking if she could help him with something else this time. He seemed to hesitate, as if he didn't want to ask too much of her. His eyes flickered for a brief moment, but Claire didn't catch the look. Before he spoke, he wanted her to adjust the seat back a little. It was a small request, but it seemed important to him. The discomfort on his face clear as he shifted once more. Claire opened her mouth, ready to say something dismissive, but then she stopped herself. She could see the slight tremble in his hand and the frustration building in his eyes, and suddenly her irritation vanished. A strange feeling washed over her, and for the first time since the flight began she felt a pang of guilt. She wasn't sure why, but she knew she had to help this time. She knelt beside him and gently adjusted the seat back as best she could. He didn't say anything, but his eyes softened just a little, as if he appreciated the effort. Claire stood up quickly, brushing off the awkwardness she felt rising in her chest. She gave him a brief nod and moved on, but this time there was something different. She couldn't explain more, but she knew she hadn't just helped a passenger, she had done something more. And then, as she moved to the next row, she heard a faint murmur from behind her, the veteran's voice again. But this time it wasn't just a request, it was a statement, one that made her freeze. "I've seen things that would make your blood run cold." Claire's heart skipped a beat. She didn't turn around, but the words lingered in the air, like a whisper that wouldn't fade away. Claire paused for a moment, unsure of what she had just heard. The words hung in the air, like a strange echo in the cramped cabin. She wanted to turn around to acknowledge him, to ask him what he meant, but something stopped her. She wasn't sure if it was fear or something deeper, something she couldn't quite place. But she kept walking, moving to the next row, where a young couple needed help with their seatbelt. She forced a smile and went through the motions, but the words from the veteran lingered at the edge of her mind. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to him than she had first thought. The plane continued its journey through the sky. The hum of the engines was a constant reminder of how small and fragile they all were up there, but Claire's mind was elsewhere. She couldn't stop thinking about the veteran, his words, his presence, the way he carried himself, as if he had seen more than anyone else in that cabin ever would. And in that moment she realized how little she knew about the people who flew on these planes, the stories they carried with them, the lives they had lived. She kept her distance from the veteran for the rest of the flight, stealing occasional glances at him from the corner of her eye, but never engaging, not wanting to stir something inside herself that she couldn't control. There was an odd feeling brewing in her chest, something that told her she wasn't supposed to know the full truth about him, not yet anyway. The turbulence hit unexpectedly. The plane jolted, causing Claire to lose her balance for a split second, her hand gripping the nearest seat back for support. The cabin filled with nervous whispers. Some passengers gasped. As the plane dipped again, the lights flickered, and As the turbulence began to subside, Claire felt the tension in her body slowly ease. But her mind was still racing. She had never seen anything like that before, the way the veteran had stepped forward so confidently, as if he had done this 1,000 times before. It made her question everything she had thought about him. She had seen countless passengers over the years, but none had ever made her feel this way. None had ever had this kind of presence, the kind that made you second-guess everything you thought you knew. She moved through the cabin, checking on passengers. Some were still shaken up, but others were calming down as Claire spoke softly to them, reassuring them that everything would be fine. But her eyes kept darting back to the veteran, who now sat quietly in his seat once again, his face unreadable, his eyes still scanning the cabin, as though something was lurking just beyond the walls of the plane, something he could sense. But no one else could feel. She couldn't shake the feeling that he knew something she didn't, that he was waiting for something. It wasn't until a few minutes later, when she went to check on him, that she noticed something strange. He wasn't sitting like he had before. His posture was different now. His back straighter, his shoulders squared, his hands resting calmly on his knees, his eyes still locked on the door at the front of the plane, as though he was anticipating something. She wasn't sure what it was, but there was a quiet intensity about him now that made her uneasy in a way she couldn't explain. "Are you all right, sir?" Claire asked hesitantly, her voice softer than she meant it to be. The veteran didn't immediately respond, his eyes flickering briefly toward her, but he didn't say anything at first. He just stared ahead, his hands gently gripping the armrest, as if he was preparing himself for something he had seen before. Then finally he spoke in a low voice, almost as if he were speaking to himself. "I've been in situations like this before, not in the sky, but on the ground, where the air was thick with fear, and you didn't know what was coming next. You just had to trust your instincts, trust that you knew what to do." Claire felt a chill run down her spine. She wasn't sure if it was the way he spoke or the words themselves, but something about them sent a shiver through her. It was as if he wasn't just talking about turbulence on a plane. He was talking about something deeper, something much darker. "You've been in combat?" Claire asked before she could stop herself. The veteran didn't answer right away. His eyes stayed fixed ahead for a moment, as if he were lost in thought. Then he nodded just once, slowly and without emotion. "I've been in situations where it wasn't the plane shaking or the weather that made you afraid. It was the silence before the storm, when you knew something was coming, and there was nothing you could do to stop it. You just had to prepare yourself and hope you made it out alive." Claire was speechless. The words hit her like a slap. She had never met anyone who spoke so calmly about something so terrifying. But the veteran's voice didn't shake. There was no hesitation, no fear in his tone. It was the voice of someone who had seen horrors and lived to tell the tale. It was the voice of someone who had fought through things Claire couldn't even imagine. And here he was sitting next to her, on a plane, like it was just another day. She opened her mouth to say something, but no words came out. Instead, she found herself standing there, staring at him, wondering what kind of man could have experienced what he had and still carry himself with such quiet dignity. The silence stretched between them, and for the first time in a long while, Claire felt out of her depth. She had dealt with scared passengers, stressed families, and even medical emergencies. But this was different. This was a man who had lived through things she couldn't even begin to comprehend, and all she could do was stand there in awe. Finally, the veteran turned his head toward her, just slightly, his eyes meeting hers for the first time since they had spoken, and for a brief moment Claire thought she saw a flicker of something there, something like pain or regret, but it was gone, almost immediately replaced by the same calm gaze he had worn since the beginning of the flight. "You don't need to worry," he said softly. "You're doing fine. Just remember that when the turbulence comes again, just breathe and know that it will pass." The words were simple, but they carried weight more than she could understand in that moment. But somehow they made her feel better, and yet at the same time they only deepened the mystery surrounding him. The rest of the flight passed in a haze for Claire. She moved through the cabin on autopilot, checking in on passengers, offering drinks and snacks, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the veteran, the way he had spoken earlier, the way his words hung in the air, like a warning that something was yet to unfold. She couldn't stop thinking about the stories he hinted at, the things he had seen. She had worked in this job long enough to understand that everyone had their own history, their own burdens. But the veteran was different. He wasn't like the other elderly men who sat quietly. He carried something with him, something heavy, and she wasn't sure if she was ready to know what it was. As the plane leveled out and the sky smoothed, Claire found herself walking back toward the veteran. She had avoided him for the past hour, letting the hustle of the cabin keep her busy. But now there was something pulling her toward him. She couldn't explain it. It was like an invisible thread, drawing her closer against her will, as if she needed to understand more. She stood beside his seat for a moment, unsure of what to say, but when the veteran turned his head toward her, their eyes met. And she felt a strange connection, like he knew exactly what she was thinking without her saying a word. His gaze was steady and calm. But there was something else there, something deeper, as though he had seen through the facade she had put up. "Can I help you with something?" she asked softly, her voice hesitant this time. She wasn't just a flight attendant doing her job. She was a person trying to understand a man who seemed to carry a lifetime of secrets. The veteran didn't answer immediately. He just looked at her for a long moment, his eyes searching her face, as though weighing whether or not he could trust her. But then he spoke, his voice quiet and steady, as though he had made a decision. "You don't know what it's like to be in a place where every step you take could be your last, where you have to decide in a split second whether to trust someone or not, whether to risk your life for a stranger." He said, his voice low, but filled with an emotion Claire couldn't quite place. Claire swallowed hard, her heart pounding. She had heard stories of war heroes and soldiers, but she had never met one before, not like this. The veteran wasn't boasting. He wasn't asking for recognition. He was simply stating a fact in the most matter-of-fact way, as though it was something he had lived with every day of his life. "I don't know," Claire whispered, her voice barely audible, "but I want to understand." The veteran nodded just once, as if he were acknowledging her sincerity, but then he fell silent, his eyes drifting back toward the window, as if he had said all he needed to say for now. But there was something about the way he spoke that lingered in the air. It was as if he had shared just a small fraction of a much larger story, one that would take hours to tell. And yet Claire knew she wasn't ready to hear the full truth. She wasn't sure she could handle it. For a while neither of them spoke. As the plane cruised through the sky, the hum of the engines filling the space between them, Claire felt a strange mix of curiosity and fear stirring within her. She had never felt so unsure of herself. Before, she had always been confident in her ability to handle any situation. But this man, this veteran, was different. His presence unsettled her in a way she couldn't explain, and yet it intrigued her in a way she couldn't deny. And then, just as she was about to turn away to check on the rest of the cabin, the veteran spoke again, his voice quieter this time. "There's something you should know," he said. "I didn't just survive those moments. I made it out, because I knew how to read people, how to read situations. And sometimes it's not the obvious things that will get you through. Sometimes it's the small things, the things that others miss." Claire's breath caught in her throat. His words felt like a warning, and yet she wasn't sure what they meant All she could do was nod, unsure of what to say in response. The rest of the flight was a blur. Claire went through the motions of her duties, but her mind was still with the veteran, his words echoing in her head as she tried to make sense of them. And yet she felt no closer to understanding who he was or what he had been through. All she knew was that there was more to him than met the eye, much more, and somewhere deep inside, she knew the truth would be far more shocking than anything she could ever imagine. The minutes stretched on like hours as Claire moved through the cabin checking on passengers, but her mind was constantly drawn back to the veteran, his words still lingering in her thoughts. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to him than he was letting on. Every time she glanced at him, she saw the same calm expression. But it was his eyes that gave him away. There was something haunted in them, something that spoke of a past too heavy to carry alone. As the flight neared its halfway point, Claire found herself walking down the aisle again, passing the rows of passengers. But this time her footsteps slowed as she approached the veteran's seat. He was sitting there as he had been before, his posture still straight, his hands resting lightly on his knees, his gaze fixed out the window, as if he were lost in thought. But this time there was something different about the way he carried himself. It wasn't just the air of quiet strength that surrounded him. It was something more, something subtle but unmistakable. Without thinking, Claire stopped next to his seat and asked in a soft voice, "Do you ever think about it?" She didn't know why she asked the question. It just came out, as though the words were coming from somewhere deep inside her, the place she kept hidden away from the world. The veteran didn't respond at first. His eyes flickered toward her for just a moment before he turned his gaze back to the window, as if he were weighing her question carefully. It was almost as if he were deciding how much of the truth he could share without revealing too much. For a long time there was silence between them, but Claire didn't move. She waited patiently, knowing that whatever answer he gave would come in its own time. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the veteran spoke, his voice low and steady, but there was a hint of something in his tone, something that sounded almost like regret. "Every day," he said quietly, "I think about it every day. There's not a moment that goes by when I don't remember the faces, the names, the places I've seen, the things I've done, things I had no choice but to do, things that changed me forever." Claire's heart raced at his words, her breath caught in her throat. She had expected some kind of response, but not like this, not with that level of honesty. She had no idea what to say, how to respond to someone who had lived through things she couldn't even begin to imagine. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Instead, she just nodded slowly, as if she understood. But the veteran wasn't finished. He turned his head slightly toward her, his eyes locking with hers for the first time, in a way that made her feel like he was looking straight through her. "You think you can outrun it?" He continued, his voice colder now, like he was speaking from a place deep inside himself, a place that had long been buried. "You think you can put it behind you, but you can't. No matter how far you go, it follows you, it changes you. And sometimes it feels like it's all that's left." The weight of his words hit Claire like a punch to the stomach. She had no idea what he was talking about exactly, but she could feel the rawness in his voice, the truth behind it. It was like hearing someone speak about their deepest regret, their darkest secret, the one thing they couldn't escape from no matter how hard they tried. She swallowed hard, her throat dry. She wanted to say something, but she didn't know what to say. She couldn't pretend to understand what he was going through. How could she? She had never been through anything like that. All she could do was stand there and listen as the veteran poured out pieces of himself to her without asking for anything in return. Finally, after a long pause, the veteran leaned back in his seat and let out a slow breath, as if the weight of his words had exhausted him. His eyes softened slightly, but the hardness in his expression never wavered completely. He wasn't asking for pity or sympathy. He was simply sharing his truth, something he had carried for far too long. "Sometimes it's easier to let people believe the story you want them to believe," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. It's easier to hide behind the silence than to face what's really inside. Claire nodded again, this time with more understanding. She couldn't fully comprehend what he had been through, but she knew now that he wasn't just an old man on a plane. He was someone who had been through the unimaginable and had lived to tell the tale, but only in pieces, only when he was ready to share. And as the plane continued its journey through the sky, Claire couldn't help but feel that this was just the beginning of something much deeper, something she wasn't yet ready to fully uncover. But she knew one thing for sure: she would never look at the veteran the same way again. The rest of the flight seemed to pass in a blur for Claire. She couldn't stop thinking about what the veteran had said. His words haunted her each time she passed his seat. She found herself glancing over at him, his gaze always calm. But there was something in his eyes that made her feel uneasy, something deep and unsettling that she couldn't quite understand. The mystery surrounding him was growing thicker by the minute, and she couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something huge that he hadn't shared yet. She moved through the cabin serving drinks and offering snacks, but her mind wasn't on her duties anymore. It was on him, on the man sitting silently in the corner, who had been through things she could never imagine, who had seen a lifetime of pain and survival, and somehow had come out the other side. But Claire was starting to realize that maybe he hadn't come out unscathed. Maybe the things he carried with him were more than just memories. They were scars that he would never be able to escape from. As the plane began its descent, Claire found herself walking toward the veteran's seat. Once more she tried to tell herself she was just doing her job, making sure he was comfortable for the landing, but deep down she knew it wasn't just that. She was drawn to him like a magnet, pulled by something she couldn't define. When she stopped in front of him, this time there was no hesitation in her voice. "Are you sure you're all right?" she asked, her words soft, but filled with concern, the weight of their earlier conversation still heavy in the air between them. For a long moment, the veteran didn't answer. He simply stared out the window, his face unreadable, as if he were lost in thought. But when he did speak, it was in the same low voice that had carried so much weight earlier. "I'm fine," he said, his voice almost flat, no emotion, no inflection, just the simple words, as if he was saying them to reassure himself more than anyone else. But Claire wasn't convinced. She could hear the cracks in his voice, the unspoken truth buried beneath his words. Something was off. He wasn't fine. She could feel it deep in her gut, and it made her uncomfortable. But she pressed on anyway. She had to know more. There was something about this man that she couldn't walk away from, something about him that demanded her attention. "Sometimes people say they're fine when they're not," Claire said carefully, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sometimes we say it because it's easier than admitting the truth." The veteran's eyes flickered toward her for a brief second, and Claire thought she saw something in them, a flicker of something raw and vulnerable, something that he was desperately trying to hide. But just as quickly as it appeared, it was gone, his expression returning to its usual calm, impenetrable state. "You don't need to worry about me," he said finally, his tone firm but not unkind. "I've been through much worse than this, trust me." But there was a heaviness in his words that made Claire hesitate. She opened her mouth to ask him more, to press him for answers. But before she could speak, the captain's voice came over the intercom, signaling that they were preparing for landing. The announcement shattered the fragile moment between them, and Claire found herself stepping back instinctively to prepare the cabin for the final approach. As she moved through the aisles, making sure everyone was strapped in and secure, Claire's thoughts were still on the veteran, the way he had responded to her, the way he had said those words so matter-of-factly, as if his past was something he could simply brush off. And yet she knew it wasn't that simple. It never was. The plane began its final descent, and Claire couldn't help but glance over at the veteran one last time. He was looking out the window again, his eyes distant, his expression unreadable. But there was something different about him now, something that made Claire feel a little less certain, a little more afraid of what she didn't know about him. The closer they got to landing, the more she realized how little she truly understood about the man sitting just a few rows away from her. And as the wheels touched the ground, Claire felt the strange tension in her chest ease. Just a little, but not completely, because she knew deep down that their story wasn't over yet. It was just beginning, and whatever happened next, it would change everything she thought she knew about the man who had quietly sat in the corner of the plane watching the world with eyes that had seen too much. As the plane touched down, Claire felt her heart pounding in her chest. The landing had been smooth, but the tension in her body was anything but. She moved through the motions of her duties, guiding passengers as they disembarked, and ensuring everything was in order. But her mind was still on the veteran. The feeling that something was coming, something she wasn't prepared for, had only grown stronger since the plane began its descent. It was as if the air around her had thickened with the unspoken truth that still lingered in the cabin between them. When the final passenger had exited, Claire found herself standing by the door, watching the last few rows empty out of the corner of her eye. She saw the veteran, still seated in his place, his hands folded in his lap, his gaze fixed straight ahead, as though waiting for something, waiting for her. She took a deep breath before slowly walking toward him. This time she didn't hesitate. She had to know the truth, whatever it was. She couldn't keep pretending like it wasn't there. As she reached his seat, she paused for a moment, unsure of what to say. But the veteran spoke first, his voice low and calm as always, but there was something different about it now, something that made her heart skip a beat. "It's time for you to know." He said the words so quietly she almost didn't catch them at first. But once they registered, Claire felt a chill run down her spine. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she knew it wasn't something she would be able to forget. She nodded slowly, her throat dry. "What do you mean?" The veteran looked up at her for the first time, his eyes locking with hers in a way that made her breath catch. His gaze was steady, but there was a weight in it now, something she couldn't ignore, something that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. "You're right about one thing," he said, his voice steady, but there was a hint of something darker underneath. "I'm not fine, not really. I never have been, but you've been patient with me. You've listened when no one else would, so it's time I tell you what you need to know." Claire felt her heart racing now. She couldn't move, couldn't speak. Her mind was spinning as she waited for him to continue, but the veteran's eyes softened slightly, as if he was choosing his words carefully. "I wasn't just a soldier," he said finally. "I wasn't just someone who fought in wars. I was a part of something much bigger than that, something you wouldn't believe if I told you. I was in a special unit. And the things we did weren't what you see in the movies. They weren't glamorous or heroic. They were necessary things, things that people like you will never understand. But I lived through them, and I survived because I had to." Claire stood there in stunned silence. She wanted to say something, to ask him what he meant, but the words wouldn't come. All she could do was stare at him, her mind struggling to process what he was telling her. He continued, his voice quieter now. "I've done things in my past that haunt me, everyday things that will never leave me. And I've tried to forget them, I've tried to put them behind me. But you can't outrun your past. It always catches up with you. And when it does, it changes you forever." Claire's mind raced as she tried to process everything he was saying. She wanted to know more, she wanted to understand. But part of her was scared of what the truth might be, scared of the man standing before her who seemed so calm, and yet carried the weight of 1,000 untold stories. "You don't have to say anything else," Claire finally whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "I can't ask you to share more than you're ready to." The veteran nodded just once, his eyes flickering with something like gratitude, but also something deeper, something that told Claire there was so much more, that he hadn't said, so many more layers to the story that would never be uncovered, no matter how much she wanted to know. He stood up slowly, his movements deliberate, as if every step was calculated. "I didn't want to tell you this," he said, his voice steady once again, "but I felt like you needed to know the truth, the real truth about who I am. As he made his way down the aisle toward the exit, Claire watched him go, her heart still racing, her mind still reeling from everything he had just shared with her. She knew now that the man she had seen on this flight was not just a passenger. He was a man who had lived through things that would break most people, a man who carried a history too heavy for words. And yet there he was standing before her, not asking for sympathy, but simply sharing his truth in the only way he knew how. As the last of the passengers filed off the plane, Claire stood there for a long time, her hands trembling at her sides. She knew she would never forget the veteran, the stories he carried with him, the things he had seen, and the truth he had shared with her. But she also knew that the real story was far from over. It was just beginning, and whatever came next would change everything.